Namaste. Welcome to Panthirock Academy. Hope everything is great. In my first video, I had talked about introduction of IELTS. Hope it was helpful for you. In today's video, I am here with some of the tricks of speaking section that will really helpful for you to get higher score in your IELTS examination. As I already discussed in my previous video, speaking section has three parts. Part 1, Part 2 and Part 3. In Part 1, the examiner will ask you about yourself and some familiar topics. In Part 2, the examiner will give you a cue card and you will have to speak for 2 minutes for particular topic. And then in Part 3, the examiner will ask you some questions related to the Part 2. And you will have to, let me tell you some of the tricks that will really help you to get high score in your overall 3 parts in speaking section. Remember, voice projection, posture and eye contact do not appear in the criteria for IELTS speaking examination, but they are vital in creating good impression to the examiner. The examiner struggles if the examiner is getting low eye contact, voice projection and posture, and it will of course create serious problems in understanding what you are saying, and it will definitely affect your band score. Your English speaking skill will be better and you will get a higher score if you have perfect voice projection, posture and eye contact. Your English speaking skill will be better and you will get a higher score if you have perfect voice projection, posture and eye contact. Easier to explain things and you will instantly feel more comfortable and confident. Something that is rarely talked about while preparing IELTS speaking, but it is essential which you can develop by frequent practices. The easiest technique for holding people's attention is to speak slower and to emphasize the most important words in each sentence. Your tone of voice plays key role to understand what you are saying and understand it as well. Tone comprises 4 elements: pitch, volume, pace and emphasis. While preparing for your test, just remember to talk low, slower with emphasis and with varied tone. Remember, the examiner is not a machine and will be influenced by your overall communication skills as well as your English. Okay guys, now let me give you secrets for all 3 parts of the speaking sections that will really help you to get a higher score in the speaking section. Let's get started. Speaking section Part 1. The examiner will introduce himself or herself at the start of the test and then ask you for your name and ID before you start. Here are some tips: eye contact, active listening, open body language, and speak up. Stay calm and focus on expressing your ideas clearly. Focus on speaking freely. Focus on speaking freely on any topic that the examiner asks you about, but avoid speaking quickly. Many students speak quickly in the exam because they think that is what will make them sound more fluent or because they feel nervous. This is very natural, but you should avoid speaking too fast. Instead, you should start the exam by speaking slowly and then maintain that pace for the rest of the conversation. The examiner will probably interrupt you during the test. Don't take this personally. It's perfectly normal. The reason why they do this is because they have to manage time. They only have 11 to 14 minutes and they are not assessing your ideas. So they are not there to listen to your ideas and decide whether you are right or wrong. They are only there to assess your language. So once they realize that you have understood the question and you are able to answer it correctly with correct grammar, vocabulary, structures, organization and pronunciation, they move to the next question. So don't take it personally. Everybody gets interrupted during the test. Talking about things you like and dislike. If the examiner asks you about something you like or dislike, instead of saying I like football or I don't like football, you could say something like football appeals to me because dash dash dash. Football doesn't appeal to me because dash dash dash. This will instantly give a better impression because you are still keeping it semi-formal and you are still using natural language. But you are showing that you know expressions that native speakers use all the time. Another way of talking about things you like or don't like is to say something like, I get a lot of pleasure out of watching football. Or, I get a lot of pleasure out of playing football. In the negative, I don't get much pleasure out of playing football. I don't get much pleasure out of watching football. If you are talking about something that you have enjoyed for a long period of time, you can talk about something that you have grown fond of. So, you could say, for example, I have grown fond of my car and I don't want to change it. Or, I have grown fond of my motorcycle and I don't want to upgrade it. When you don't understand what the examiner has just said, it is better to say something like, sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Sorry, could you say that again please? Or, could you explain what you mean by? This last example is perfect when you don't understand some of the vocabulary the examiner has just used. So, for example, if the examiner asks you a question and you don't understand one of the words, you could say, sorry, could you explain what you mean by democracy? While you should know what democracy means in the exam, it's always better to ask the examiner if you don't know and by asking him or her with this phrase. We are proving that we have a high level of English. These structures are also more natural and politer at the same time. Speed. The examiner will not mark you down for speaking slowly. The only time when they might penalize you is if you stop or pause constantly because you don't know the word that you want to say. So, focus on speaking freely and slowly, staying calm and keeping a constant level of interaction with the examiner. That some people speak quickly and some people speak slowly. The examiner does not know if you normally speak very quickly or if you normally speak very slowly. So, take advantage of this and take your time. Let's talk about an example. Few people say that it's important to have hobbies. As the examiner asks you more questions in part 1, you might find yourself repeating some of the same answers in different ways. But don't let this distract you. Continue to focus on being natural, relaxed and chatty. Why do people say that it's important to have hobbies? You could say something like, I think people say it's important to have hobbies because nowadays many people work long hours and in many cases they struggle to switch off when they get home, partly due to communication devices like mobile phones. I believe it's essential to be able to unwind and find things that distract you from your daily routine, as it can prevent burnout and other stress-related issues. It's also crucial to have some physical as well as intellectual hobbies, as it provides balance and stimulation and enables people to maintain good physical and mental health. Tell me about your favorite hobby. What's the most interesting thing about it in your opinion? You probably answered this already in the first question. If this was a real exam, the examiner might skip this one and go to the next question instead. But if you do ask you, you could say something like, well, if I had to choose, I would probably say that my favorite hobby is scuba diving. As I mentioned earlier, I don't always have the opportunity to go every week. It's usually once a month or twice a month maximum. But I find it really therapeutic. I always manage to distress every time I go. And I always really look forward to it. It allows me to clear my head and be in real contact with nature. I always get my best ideas after I have been scuba diving. Now, let me say some high level speaking phrases for IELTS Part 1. Please don't try to learn all these. Just read through the list and choose a few that you like and that you feel comfortable using. Make a note of these and use them in your practice answers. To talk about opinion, as far as I am concerned, as I see it from my point of view, in my humble opinion, I would say that to talk about personalized things, speaking from personal experience, for me personally, this is a topic that is particularly close to my heart. It's funny, I was just thinking about this the other day. My gut reaction is, while talking about agreement, we see eye to eye. Yeah, I'd go along with that. Absolutely. You look the words right out of my mouth. I couldn't agree more. You have a point there. I'm with you 100% on this one. Now, expressing disagreement. Disagree. Try not to argue or disagree with the examiner. I tend to disagree with that. That's not always the case. Isn't it more a case of? Finally, let me share you some impressive structures, but do not overuse them. Another point I would like to add about this is, it's also worth bearing in mind that I'd also like to point out that I think it's important not to forget that the vast majority of people tend to think that at the end of the day, when all said and done. Now, let me talk about IELTS Speaking Part 2 secrets. First, let me say you key information about Part 2. In Part 2 of this speaking test, you have to speak for 1 to 2 minutes. Try to speak for the full 2 minutes until the examiner interrupts you once you reach the 2 minutes maximum. The examiner will interrupt with a follow-up question or by saying thank you, and then he or she will go into the follow-up questions usually. It's important that you speak for the 2 minutes if you want to get the higher grades, because it shows that you have the fluency and the ability to expand your answers. We have the question card with some subpoints that give you some guidance as to what to talk about. You can change the order of these, or you can adapt them if you want. It doesn't really matter, but it's normally better to follow them because it's one less thing to concentrate on. Don't try to be too formal. A very important role in the IELTS speaking test is don't try to be too formal. Remember that the IELTS speaking test is a semi-formal exam. By that, I mean you should be respectful towards the examiner, but you always need to bear in mind that you are not in an academic presentation to a lecturer. You are in an exam that wants to test your real level of English speaking. Don't use slang or talk about controversial topics or topics that could be offensive to people. Keep your language neutral and try to be semi-formal in your approach. Speak slowly and with purpose. This will allow you to feel calmer. It has benefits. This will allow you to feel calmer. It will allow you to express yourself better. It will allow you to think. It will allow you to pronounce and emphasize your sentences far better. Keep it simple. One of the most important things you can do to improve your IELTS score in the speaking test is not to try to sound as smart as possible and use complex structures. complex sentences or obscure words to explain simple things. Try to keep things simple because that's what natural, native level communication is about. Learn alternative words and structures to use, but you should practice those structures and those words so much at home that they come out naturally when you do the test. In the test, you should be focusing on being natural and being talkative, not on using complex vocabulary or using complex sentences. When candidates try to use complex sentences to impress the examiner, what usually happens is that they make more mistakes and they sound less natural in English. When native speakers who are educated to degree level or master's level or PhD level speak, they don't usually try to complicate their language as much as possible because it would be unnatural and would make communication worse. Rounding up questions. If the examiner asks you a follow-up question, you should provide a short, natural response. Don't go into any long explanations or details about anything. Just provide a natural response to the question. If you were having a relaxed conversation, the whole point of this question is simply to finish this part of the exam. It's the end of part 2. Clear communication checklist. Keep your sentences simple and direct. Remove unnecessary words to make your communication more effective and powerful. Remember that no matter who you are speaking to, they are human. So relate to them as a human. Be as specific as possible. Avoid the passive voice like the plague, unless you have no choice. Instead of saying the project was launched by the government, use an active sentence like the government launched the project. Active sentences tend to sound more alive and as a result more interesting. When the examiner asks you a question you have already talked about, don't be surprised if the examiners ask you a question which you have just answered in your previous response. Sometimes, when you respond to a question, you will inadvertently answer the next question that the examiner was going to ask. The examiner might just ask you again anyway. Don't be surprised and don't feel bad. Don't assume that the examiner hasn't understood you or hasn't listened. Just answer the question as if you hadn't answered it before. If you want, you can try to answer in a slightly different way by paraphrasing. But don't feel nervous, don't feel bad, and don't feel like the examiner didn't understand. It's just part of the process. What to say if you need time to think in the exam? If you need time to think in the exam because you are not sure of what to say, you can start by saying, "It's quite a difficult question, but I suppose," or you can say, "That's a really interesting question, I suppose," or you can say, "I have never thought about it before, but I suppose." Let's talk on a sample question of part 3. How do you think things have changed since your grandparents' time? Another typical exam style question. The exam often includes a question about how things have changed in some way, comparing past and present habits or behaviors. The key language you need to dominate here is used to, past simple and present tense. Beyond that, you need to be comfortable with speculating. Here is a simple example. Wow, that's a difficult question. I'm not entirely sure how things have changed since my grandparents' time, but if I had to guess, I would probably say that teenagers spend more time in front of screens with technology now. They communicate online a lot, whereas this wasn't an option in my grandparents' time. They probably listen to a lot more music and they play a lot more computer games as well. They probably play a wider range of sports because, let's face it, the only sport people played 60-70 years ago was probably football. With globalization, a lot of different hobbies and sports have spread all over the world. So, I think more people play sports like tennis now. And perhaps 70 years ago, this was only for the elite. Many teenagers also play basketball now. But they probably didn't used to 70 years ago. 7, 7.5 or 8 level speaking phrases for IELTS Part 3. Okay, so here is a long list of possible phrases, structures and words you could use to add a bit of salt and pepper to your speaking in Part 3 and get an 7, 7.5 or 8. However, you do not need to use any of them to get an 8 or 8.5. These are just extra phrases for you to choose the ones you like and are comfortable using and think about adding them to your practice. Do not stress and do not start writing them all down and studying their definitions, please. Focus on 3 or 4 that you like and you are comfortable using, and then introduce them into your answers when you do the practice exercises later on. Finally, let me share you some useful phrases. I don't feel this is a direct cause of. Of course, it goes without saying that. There has been a growing body of opinion that the situation can be addressed by adopting the methods mentioned above. While I admit that, I would argue that one approach would be, a second possibility would be, obviously, however, this suggests that, in addition, to sum up, in fact, I tend to disagree. I am unconvinced why, overall, in the final analysis, ultimately, to conclude, in conclusion, on the other hand, there is no doubt that this could involve, thirdly, expressing views. I would argue that I firmly believe that it seems to me that I tend to think that people argue that, some people think that, many people feel that. In my experience, it is undoubtedly true that, and it is certainly true that, refuting an argument, I am unconvinced that, I do not believe that, it is hard to accept that, it is unjustifiable to say that, there is little evidence to support that, providing support. For instance, indeed, in fact, of course, it can be generally observed that statistics demonstrate. If this is the cause, firstly, naturally, in my experience, to illustrate, defining, explaining, I would argue that, by this I mean, in other words, this is to say, to be more precise, here I am referring to use sparingly, a little. First, second, moreover, in addition, furthermore, nevertheless, nonetheless, on the one hand, on the other hand, besides, consequently, In contrast, in comparison, use moderately. Meanwhile, although, despite the fact that, even though, is a result, however, since, similarly, thus, in tone, introducing a false argument. It could be argued that some people would argue that there is also the idea implicit in the statement that it is often suggested that demolishing a false argument. This is partly true, but to a certain limited extent, there is some truth in this. However, the implication that is oversimplification. This argument has certain specific logic, but proposing a correct argument, it is clear that the real situation is, obviously, I think it is therefore quite wrong to suggest that. These are the secrets for you guys from my side. Apply them fully in your IELTS speaking examination, and I'm sure they will really help you to get a higher score. Before I end this video, I would like to request you to give constructive feedback below in the comment. And remember to like, comment, share, and most importantly, subscribe. See you in the next video. Bye-bye.